give the deer hands and a gun and camouflage.
Yeah.
And engineered also so that it has the intelligence of a person.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's real hunting.
Now it's the most dangerous game.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 458 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the art making person.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's March 8th, 22x4.
Yes, March 8th.
March 8th is one of the best days. Also, there's going to be profanity in this show. Lots of cursing, swearing, stuff like that. So be ready for that. It's going to be great. Also,
Discord's being a little janky on us right now. So if you hear us talking over each other a little more than usual, which is already a lot, then that's definitely the reason. It's not because of our own misbehavior.
Yup.
or, who knows?
Or maybe both.
It's hard to track these things down sometimes, which is something we'll talk about today. And before we get into it, though, I do want to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for the monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. We appreciate it quite a bit. All right, so there's just a couple things we want to talk about studio-wise today. And maybe we'll have time for a question at the end. I don't want to be too optimistic.
don't push it, buddy.
Yeah. All right. So first off, I want to talk about crashes. Okay. Crashes meaning you're playing a game and suddenly it's dead.
Boom.
Right? We've all been there. It doesn't happen that often with a lot of like AAA kind of titles and stuff. Unless, well, I guess nowadays it kind of does.
Well, I think you're much more likely to see just jank in the game than
An outright
full-on
crash.
Full-on crashes.
Yes.
Yeah. So crashes are an interesting problem from a development perspective because there's actually a couple different kinds of crashes, and we've been really struggling with one of them.
It's been since November or something, right?
Since September, actually. We started really tracking it in October and putting a lot of resources into trying to pin it down. And we think we might have found the cause of it this week. So I want to talk a little bit about like what is this like, and what are the problems when you're trying to track something like this down?
The 6-month crash saga. Let's go.
Yeah. So when you're programming something and you get an error, oftentimes that is great because the compiler or the crash or whatever will generate some kind of a log that will tell you exactly where the error is. Oftentimes even like down to the line number. So you can just go and look at that spot in the code and you can just be like, what happened here? Then you can kind of add some stuff to that to like get more information, like kind of spit more details out into the console. And you can start to sort of do some detective work, and because you've got a starting point, you got a crime scene, that you can work from. It kind of reminds me of like I think there was like a webcomic in the programmer humor community that was like some programmer sitting at his desk and he's like, yes, finally, and then somebody else is like, oh, did you fix that error? And the programmer's like, no, I got a different one.
Yeah,
it's like because that's information, that's something that you can work with, and it means that you might be getting like closer to figuring out what's really going on behind the scenes, because you never want to just like fix the expression of the error. You want to get to the root cause of it and stop it there.
Yeah,
Well, I
the
think
art of debugging is this information triangulation, right? Where you're trying to collect as much info as you can to try to triangulate where something is happening, and you're simultaneously trying to compare your understanding of how this stuff works with the information that you're seeing to rule out what it couldn't be versus what it could be, and you're trying to narrow it down as quickly as possible to get to the actual cause.
I think the metaphor of a crime scene is actually pretty good, right? Because again, the intent with the crime scene is not just to clean it up, right? It's to make it so you figure out who did some crimes here. Like check the blood splatters on the wall, check the materials used, are there footprints, etc. Right?
Yeah. So that's a crash that has a log. Has a known spot where something went wrong. That's not the kind of crash that we've been dealing with for the past 7 or 8 months or whatever.
Spooky.
We have a crash that's what's often referred to as a silent crash, meaning there's no information. No, there's
The game
nothing,
just is
nothing
off now.
you'll be playing the game, and now you're not playing the game. And if you go look at the error logs and the debug output, nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Game just stopped. It just stopped running. It's kind of like if you're a detective, right? And instead of a crime scene, you just get a newspaper article, and it just says someone died, mm-hmm. And you're like, what? Was that supposed to happen? Where was it? Was it expected? How far away was it? And then the next day,
it's almost even more like basically a collection of missing person reports, because there's no information in those logs that we had that was even similar in a sense. It's like wasn't happening in the same spot. So
it's just random.
It's actually more like a person report, as in like, is the person missing? Is there?
Yeah, we don't even know. It's just something bad happened. Mm-hmm. And all you're getting is just these reports, just that something happened, but with no discernible pattern or cause or location or anything, right? So if you're a detective, what the fuck do you do? All you know is that something bad has happened, which means you can't triangulate. You can't even start. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to canvass the entire knock on every single door, and honestly, yeah, kind of. Like, that's kind of what we've been doing.
If you think of if you think of a linear program where it's just like input, output, a bunch of steps, you get to the end, right? Then in that kind of a case, you can still triangulate this kind of a thing relatively quickly, right? Because there's a really small number of ways that things happen, and you can start putting some rails in. We can be like, I'll put a comment here, and I'll put a comment there, and I'll see which comment actually shows up in the logs and which one doesn't, and that way I know it's in between those two things, and you can, which is what you do in the case where it's not linear too, but it's just that for the nonlinear case, it could be anywhere. The problem could be in so many places that you can't even figure out, like, where do I actually try to add additional logging information to figure out how to narrow it down.
Yeah. And so what I think to kind of like further get into a little bit into the technical weeds of like what we were seeing is we were seeing something that looked like the consequence of memory corruption. And what, we've all heard about RAM, random access memory. The sticks that you plug into your PC to make it be able to run Chrome,
or
basically.
The thing you pay an extra like $1,000 to Apple to get a little bit of in your new phone.
Yeah, and the thing that Apple never reports on their website and tech specs because they don't put enough into their phones, so they just don't tell you how much it has. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but if you ever want to get tech specs for an Apple phone, you cannot go to the Apple site because they exclude tech specs that don't look good. So you have to go to separate external sites that actually reverse engineer and figure out what's in it.
So RAM's important.
RAM's important. And RAM is basically like is your device will load up all the information that it needs, whether that's like all the variables or all of the textures often go into like video memory, but it's the same kind of concept. Like there's a lot of stuff that the game needs to be able to very quickly reference or show to the player. And the fastest way to do that is to have that stuff loaded into memory.
Yeah, because the two main places that you can get it are off of the disk, off of the hard drive, right, or out of memory,
which is slower.
Yeah, and memory. Modern like hard drives are really fast these days, but they're still like a tenth as fast as
well, and they still do a lot of. There's a lot of like meta level processing that happens when you write files to disk. Like the operating system is doing a lot to catalog those files and stuff like that. So like it's much faster to just have everything loaded up in RAM, ready to go. Well, when the game is retrieving that information from RAM, it does so via memory pointers. So it just knows where that thing is in RAM. And whenever you're like, what's in this variable? Then it's almost like a coat check. Like it has a little tag. It's like, oh, well, that variable information is stored over there in the RAM. So let me go grab that for you, And every time you want to reference it, it's got to use that pointer and go grab.
Pointers are confusing. Like it's one of the confusing things you first learn, and if you're doing any like C++ or any of that kind of thing, right? But I think it's one of the few perfectly named features, because it just
points at a spot.
It just points. It's a pointer. Just points at a spot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a memory corruption event then is basically like someone coming into code check and kind of just like
shuffles some tags around.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that can happen, right? One is you get the wrong tag, so you're looking at the wrong spot. But the other one is that the spot that you're pointing to, which is correct, that something else came into when you weren't looking and like rifled through your pockets and stole the money out of it, or cut a patch out of your coat and stuck a patch of somebody else's coat into that spot,
or it's just someone else's coat,
or it's just someone else's coat. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Point being, like when memory pointers get fucked up, then you have no predictability of what's about to happen, right? Because the stuff that's going on behind the scenes is suddenly it's just scrambled egg back there. So that's the kind of crash that we were seeing. And the reason that's so hard to pin down is not only because you have no logs, is that you actually don't know when the memory got corrupted. All you know is that sometime later, when you went back to go get your coat, something was wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't happen at the moment where you check your code. And this is the tricky thing. You get this lag between the actual problem essentially happening and then your ability to see it happening and the consequence of it happening.
Yeah, the consequences of the problem.
In the same way that if you have a whole bunch of people going in and out of a coat check, right? And any one of those people could be cutting people's coats open or whatever, right? And so you check your code in there. Depending on when you chuck it out, then that dictates basically whether or not somebody had the chance to cut a hole in it, right? But who was it that cut the hole in it? I don't know. 100 people have been back there since you checked your code, right?
And you weren't there watching. Nobody was watching. There's no security footage, right? And so what do you do? Now instead in this scenario, instead of there being 100 people at a party, there's 1 billion people at this party. Yep. Okay, because we have a lot of variables, lots and lots of things happening in this game, and sometimes we wouldn't see these silent crashes until the game had been running for an hour. What has happened in an hour?
A lot.
So fucking many things, right? And so what we had to do to try to pin this thing down was just add just an astronomical amount of logging to our code so that we could see nearly everything that was happening at all times, which, by the way, really hits performance. Like that really, It's not great to be just constantly generating debug logs. We did it. And just by chance this week, I booted up the game. I did some stuff and I got one of those silent crashes. And I was like, oh man, because, again,
it's been happening every day.
What are you going to do? And so I booted up the game. I went back in and I did the same thing that I had done before. And I got the silent crash again. This time it was in like 20 seconds. And I was like, wait.
Yeah, this is similar to that joke you told earlier where you're like, when a programmer is like, oh yeah, and you're like, oh, I found a different problem. In this case, this is the reproducibility, right? Which is not
reproducibility.
Like the biggest point of celebration during debugging isn't even fixing it. It's being able to reproduce the problem consistently with the same sequence of steps. Because the moment you can do that, now you have what you need to be able to actually triangulate it.
So you can triangulate, yeah. And so I was like, okay. And I started adding some more logging, around the moment where that happened. And I went in and I did it again. I got the crash again. And so I started to, and I'm not going to go into some specifics of what was probably happening behind the scenes, but it was crazy. And it was at the engine levels. This was something that Game Maker was doing that we don't actually have control over. And we had been sort of coordinating with the Game Maker team about this, but we could never reproduce this crash in a way that we could then send over to them so that they could triangulate the problem in the engine.
Which is one of those things too, if you're leaving feedback about, software you're using or game or whatever, if this is why if your report is basically like, oh, it stopped working or it doesn't work or it crashed or whatever, and that's the end of what happened. This is why, like, if you go anywhere
nobody
at all,
can work with that.
They're going to ask for reproducibility. And it can be really frustrating on your side because you're like, I can't reproduce it. I just need you to fix it. They're like, well, if we can't reproduce it either, we can't fix it.
How do we fix it?
Yeah.
Because the way that you do this is you need a crime scene. If all you send somebody is, hey, somebody died. Can you figure out what happened? You're like, fuck no, I can't. Like, people die all the time. I don't know what this is. So I started to see something that looked like reproducibility. And the other kind of slippery thing that has happened with this silent crash is when somebody does start to be able to seem like they can reproduce it, then within like a few attempts of them trying to reproduce it, it would stop happening.
Yeah. It was just the worst kind of bug in the fucking universe.
Yeah. Cause like the best bugs are ones where like, if I do thing A, B, C, D, the crash happens, right? Every single time. Well, if you do thing A, B, C, D and then it happens, and then the next time you do exactly those steps, it doesn't happen, then what the fuck? Like, what do you do with that? So we found something that kind of started looking like we were like it was the memory corruption was happening in such a way, just based on the random luck of the draw of how the situation played out, that the crash was happening immediately after the corruption event. Is what it looked like, which means like, again, that downstream problem. It's kind of like you check your code into code check, and while you're looking at the code, somebody just comes in and rips a hole in it. You're like, wait, I saw that. I know what happened here. What the fuck are you doing? As opposed to, 40 minutes later, you're coming back from the party and then your code's all damaged.
Yeah,
right?
In this case, it's more like what we saw is you handed off your coat and then it just had, and then you saw it just have a rip in it. Now you didn't see how the rip got in there, but you put your coat, you were watching your coat and you saw it develop a hole.
Yeah.
Right?
And so at that point, in this scenario, I can look around and be like, okay, who's around me right now? Okay, I can find a culprit, right? Because like somebody is very close to my coat who did this, right? And so, I figured out how to replicate this thing, and in order to do it, we put together this crazy scenario in Crashlands 2.
That is very hilarious.
It involved a large number of explosions, exploding rocks, and essentially a giant racetrack that would blow up the character while simultaneously yanking you in a huge loop around the world, constantly destroying things and picking items up to try to recreate the scenario that would make this crash happen. And it worked. We were able to package that thing up and send it over to the game maker team. And they're like, yeah.
They found it.
You found it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then they were able to kind of track it down from there, and they were able to make a smaller replication project that caused that crash to happen.
Yeah, because on their case, they actually know because once we narrowed it down to it's literally, there was a single built-in game maker function call that's doing a particular kind of thing. And we narrowed down, we're pretty sure this thing is doing it. We don't have enough information to know why, how, under what circumstances, et cetera, right? But we know that it's this thing.
But this is where it's happening.
And since we can hand it off to the game maker team, who they know the internals of the whole thing, then that's what allows them to get to a reproducibility with a much smaller example, because they can now look at it and do the same thing that we're doing. But now they know about, because we know about our game, they know about the game engine, right? And so now they can play the same game all over again. The same triangulation game of trying to figure out, okay, if it's here, then what are the things that could be the explanation for that? And they can narrow down further and end up with a much smaller reproducible case, which they did.
Yeah. So again, it's the detective work. You need enough clues to go on to figure out what happened here and how do you keep it from happening again, right? So I mean, ever since this started happening in September or so, and we started really ramping up trying to figure it out. I mean, between myself, and our QA team, I would guess that we've put at least 40 man hours per week into trying to reproduce this thing. Because the fact is,
expensive.
The thing is, if we ship the game that has this in it, like I was saying before, because of the way that this thing worked, oftentimes you yourself would not see that crash until quite a while of gameplay. But then once you saw it, you were very likely to see it again with some regularity, but still unpredictably. Mm-hmm. And so what that means for our players is you'd start playing Crashlands 2, you'd be like, well, yeah, this is great. And then suddenly the game's dead. Like, what? And then you'd boot it up, and then you'd play for another little bit, and the game's dead again, right? And that might only happen to 5% of our players or something, but it might happen to all of them. Mm-hmm. We don't know. It's unpredictable.
Right? I think the further problem with memory corruption is what happens when it doesn't crash, right? Because you can have the memories
get swapped out.
Yeah, because now the game can start behaving really surprisingly in ways that are also detrimental to the player experience, but in weird ways.
In ways that we can't track down or debug or fix.
Yeah, because the crash isn't necessarily the worst case scenario. In fact, it's actually great in some ways because it basically clears memory and you get to start fresh, right? Because the weirder stuff is where, because now you can end up with corrupted save files, right? Where something weird is in memory, eventually gets written to disk, and then the next time the game goes to load it, now we've taken that weird behavior, we've put it permanently into the person's save, right? And now you got a corrupted save, and now that's it.
That's no good. Yeah, and the thing is, we're not an airplane manufacturer. We have to meet certain standards. The doors have to stay on and the wheels have to stay on when this thing goes, because otherwise, there's going to be consequences for us, right?
Because we could go out of business if we fuck it up too badly, right?
Yeah, if Boeing kills a million people with their airplanes, it's fine. They'll probably get some. When I say it's fine, I mean they'll get a fine, and it'll be fine.
It's a fine. Yeah.
So
the benefit of being a monopoly, we can
so
only dream someday.
We've been stressing about this thing real hard because again, it's like it's not in our control. It's something in the engine. The game maker team has also been stressing about it, but they couldn't do anything about it because like we were seeing it and they were not seeing it at all. Like they had never reproduced it.
I mean, imagine if we'd had to launch by now, right? If we'd had to launch already, which for a while it looked like we were going to have to be launching basically very early this year. If that's where we had ended up, like we would have to launch with this. We'd have no other choice because we couldn't fucking find it, right? And now today we'd be dealing with bug reports from hopefully a million players. We're now like,
and what do we say? Our answer is like, yeah, we know, like we know that that's happening.
Yeah,
and we literally
it's bad. It's pretty embarrassing and a bad experience. But
yeah, and so it's crazy. I mean, we think that, or at the very least, like we've tracked down this thing. There, it's always possible that there's some other thing going on as well in the engine that might be doing some kind of memory corruption thing. But we've definitely pinned down this one. And oh my God, like so this happened on Wednesday this week. We're kind of like, we figured it out. And then coming in on Thursday, it felt weird, like not having to dedicate a quarter of my day to this
attempting to replicate the problem and then failing.
That I've had to put hours each day into for like 8 months. It's just like, what's happening? What do I do? What do I do with my hands? Very strange.
But I think it's also interesting from a dev standpoint because, for those of our listeners who maybe aren't necessarily working in the space full time or don't have that much experience with it. It's one of those things where like when you dream of making games, you don't dream of fighting an engine level bug for 6 months, burning, tremendous amounts of time in the process and being just kind of like driven slowly insane by it. You know what I mean? Like that's not what you think about.
When you have a whole stack of like things that you want to be adding to the game, but also knowing that if the game just keeps dying on your players, it doesn't matter what you put into it. So people are going to have a bad time. And so like it makes everything that you do feel weirdly pointless. And like you're just like praying for a good outcome.
It's more like it's like that dog in the house on fire thing where it's like you got to kind of, in some ways you have to separate where you're continuing as is being like, this is fine. But then in the background, you're trying to arrange for
you're like, I know this isn't fine,
I know it's
but
fine.
Like I still got to move forward with the things that I can control. And then just wherever possible, whenever this thing happens, take some time to try to triangulate it a little bit more, and then that was it. So, man, what a time. What a time. And it's very easy in these cases too, to like get salty about the engine developers, it's like we make bugs in our code that are sometimes hard to track down. Like we actually had to take quite a bit of time in the original Crashlands because of a DS map bug in our questing system that was causing downstream crashes kind of like this that I had created. Let's take ownership of that, that I had created. And that took a couple of weeks to resolve of just like full time me just constantly digging through it and trying to figure it out, and like these things happen. And no matter how careful you are, no matter how good your testing is, you can't cover every case, and especially ones that create weird downstream effects that are hard to trace back, right? And so, the Game Maker crew was just as bewildered by this as we were, and I think we've come together to resolve it. So, what a journey!
What a time to be alive. Well,
so otherwise,
in many ways, this is just like it's the reminder, like kind of as you're saying, like you don't imagine if you're making games, this is what you're spending your time doing, right? Yeah. And I think that's that distinction between like kind of the romance of a game. Like a game is a vehicle for like escapism and and joy and like and challenge and all kinds of stuff, right? But the background of making it is just the same as everything else in life, It's just like everything is on fire all the time.
It has its good parts, has its bad parts.
Do your best.
Yeah. So aside from, all of that, we've been really blasting forward on the husk, the second major zone or biome of the the story in Crashlands 2. It's been pretty cool kind of watching Sam do all this work, especially with the game changer, because when we worked on the first zone, we were building the game changer while we were building the first zone. And as a result, a lot of the stuff we did in the first zone was a bit more constrained with what we can do now in the second zone. And each thing that we added in the first zone just took way, way longer to add to the game than this. It was much harder to iterate on. So now, Sam, if you want to talk a bit about what this has been like developing out kind of all the resources.
I think the comedy of it is that the resource development that happened in as far as time from getting started on it to actually having, say, all the resources. And what I mean by resources is, in any one of the zones in the original Crashlands, you have basically trees and rocks and stuff like that you break.
It's like down. The environment, all the things that you can harvest.
Yeah, it's essentially your base of the environment on which then the creatures are going to come in and they'll be kind of forming a little ecosystem with those things. So in the first zone in Crashlands 2, that whole development of that thing, I mean, frankly, it took basically 3 years start to finish because, even up until pre-alpha, we were finishing out basically the alpha test we did in November. We were basically tying up a bunch of loose ends that we, like Seth was saying, we just didn't have the systems available yet to be able to fully finish certain ideas that we had started, right? So you get like halfway through implementation of a particular resource or halfway through its ability or something like that, hit a point where we couldn't do it, but that little systemic extension would just kind of get added onto the list, and then depending on priority, kind of slowly but surely chipping away at that, right? So what's been, I think, funny about it is developing a whole new zone, but with all the tools available, because it basically took like a week and a half to make the tile set, right?
All the ground.
Yeah, or about, I think it's about 2.5 weeks to make the ground, right? And then now it's been about 3 weeks to make the resources that sit on top of that, right? And
yeah, so 3 years versus 6 weeks.
Yeah, which is insane, right?
That was the point of like all this. What I want to say though, like it took years to make the first zone, but actually we had most of the stuff in there within the first year.
There was a lot of parts that were available in there, but a lot of it was, like I said,
it wasn't very well integrated, and it was
missing that like finishing functionality where it's like it would get to a point where it existed technically, but didn't hit the design spec we were trying to hit for, right? Until much later.
And like we kind of looked at where we were at after the first year and where we wanted to be, and we were like, we can't make it. Like we can't get all the stuff we need based on the pace that we're moving. That's when we hit pause. We worked on the game changer, but then the follow-up to having the game changer was then rebuilding the first zone using the game changer, like basically migrating all those hard-coded assets and stuff into this new format. So it's basically like a year of sort of concepting out the first zone, and also a lot of the game systems and everything. Nothing exists at the beginning. So it's not just building the zone, it's also building every game system in that first year. And then the second year was essentially a full rebuild of the game to make it so that we could do what we're doing now, which is just blast out this content at light speed.
So I think what's interesting about it is but that's also changed the approach, because previously, essentially, the systems dev was slow, right? Seth was working on these things in the background. And every time we would want to add like a new capability, because oftentimes it would require other additional capabilities, like a big stack of stuff to get done. It would just take a while before that could reach a point of being finished. And so what that meant was that on my side, I had a lot of time to essentially like more or less fully finish a thing before it was even possible to iterate on it in game. And so I could do, especially for animations and stuff, there's certain parts of any one of these processes, art in particular, that have very heavy, very work intensive pieces, right? Where animation in particular is one of those things that is a very heavy lift, almost no matter what the context.
Especially in 2D, because oftentimes animation means fully redrawing a thing.
Yes.
Totally,
And so even with the way we do it, which is basically trying to be very economical, even with that, it's a heavy lift. And so, you're talking about a resource that, maybe does a cool thing, which means it needs to animate itself and all this. And figuring those things out takes a couple of days, versus like the actual generation of a resource might actually take now a day, right? And so what was interesting before is that because all that systems work was going on in the background, then I would be able to essentially move a thing I'd finish it visually, but then sometimes you wouldn't see them in game for months until stuff was hooked up to support them.
Oh, yeah. Our cycle times were for an individual asset were something like 3 months. Like Sam would make something, and then because there was also a stack of priorities of game systems that needed to get coded and all this other stuff, then that asset would just sit there, just waiting to be brought into the game for 3 or 4 months at a time. It's just not good. Not a good feedback loop.
But what's interesting about that, though, is that then building out the second zone has also then resulted in having to, it's in some ways renegotiate how to build it out, right? Because the first one was built in a different context.
And then just converted.
Yeah, and then converted versus this one being built when the systems are all available. And also there's other work happening on top of the work that I do. So, Jen, who's doing all the narrative work, is essentially doing a fast follow, where as I get the zone printed, then she's coming in and starting to, like, I believe as of this week, the characters entering that space.
It's like the Wallace and Gromit gif of, of the dog putting down the train track while riding the train. And they're like, yeah, exactly.
Yep. And so there's different considerations there, right? Which is, it's no longer about, for me, just finishing out like, oh, this creature now is fully animated. I like whole thing start to finish is available. It's like, actually, it'd be better to get everything roughed in so that we can build the whole zone so that everybody who's participating knows all the stuff that's in it and that will happen. And we can we'll leave some of those details and some of those big pieces of work that'll actually delay finishing out essentially the broader, almost like the not as deep of a finish of the zone until a little bit later. So I'm really excited because having those resources more or less done. I'm doing a bunch of revisions over the next couple of days, but having them more or less done means that like the zone, we have the base of the fucking thing. And while doing the work always makes it feel like it's slow as fuck. It has only been a couple of weeks.
It's only been a couple of weeks.
So it's kind of nice.
Well, it's also been really cool to see how the Game Changer has allowed us to really sort of embrace our iterative design philosophy, where if things move slowly and are hard to do, then you have to come in with a plan and you got to stick to the plan, because if the plan changes, you can barely adjust to it and other people definitely can't adjust to it. So that's why we love game jams, because when you're making a jam game, the game is so simple and has so few moving parts, and you're cutting enough corners that everything is a very, very fast iterative loop. Like no jam game has a 3-month cycle time for getting an asset into the game. It's just like we just need an asset. Just make it, get it. All right, it's a little too big. Oh well, fuck it. We'll just throw it in there. On to the next one, right? And you can, when you're doing a jam, you can see how the game is coming together and you can iterate on how it feels sort of in real time. You boot it up, you play it, you're like, ooh, it would be cool if this thing exploded like that instead of, right? And you're like, okay. And then in 5 minutes, you're like, how's this? Because you got that change in 5 minutes. When we were working on the first zone, we couldn't really do that because the feedback loop was so long. And we would often have times where like Sam would make something, 3 months later, it would finally be in the game. And then I'd come back to Sam and I'd be like, hey, can we get some changes to this thing? And he'd be like, let me find it, I guess. And like trying to figure out where even how it
can. It's just like, I gotta go like completely.
You got to rebuild the mental context of like, how did I put this asset together? How are the spine animations put together? And there's this huge mental load to iterating when things are moving that slowly. And it also it keeps you from being responsive to the game itself as a developer. So in my GDC talk from back in the day, the Design by Chaos talk, I talked about how, the goal for us is to be able to play the game and just listen to the game and just see how it feels and just read your own feelings as you play it. And if you're feeling like, oh, it'd be so cool if blah happened, right? All right, let's talk about that. What would it take to get that thing to happen? Can we do it? Let's do it. And sure, maybe that thing wasn't in the design document or something, but now the game is better. You chase the bliss, chase the joy that pops out, right? And so when we're working on this new zone, it has felt like a jam, honestly, where we can get stuff in there and kind of talk about the drift bulb.
Yeah, you could, sure.
Talk about. It's just one example of a thing that we pulled into added into this new zone. We were like, we want like a weird ass thing that's not really a plant, but also not really a creature, kind of like a jellyfish. Something that's like brainless and hard to classify, right? But that's kind of everywhere. And so we've got this thing that at the moment it's called a drift bulb. You know, the zone is being rapidly iterated on, so who knows whether it'll keep that name or even if it'll exist in the final version of the game. But you know, probably will. And the initial idea was like, oh yeah, it's just kind of like this floating weird thing that's kind of jellyfish-like that is like drifting around this zone, and there's a bunch of these things, and it's just kind of like a resource that you can harvest, right? So that's what we had at the outset, and you know that just it looks cool, but it's not that interactive. It's like any other basic resource where you would just kind of chop it and it would explode into parts, right?
But what's weird about hitting it, I was thinking because we put it in, you know, within minutes essentially. What's weird about hitting that thing is that it didn't react to being hit. It didn't float away. You know what I mean? It didn't feel like weird. Was happening.
Yeah, it felt weird to hit a thing that basically feels like a balloon and have it be static in the air, just not moving, right? And so we're like, well, I mean, we got to have some kind of knockback. Well, the Game Changer has a drop down thing where you can just be like, put a knockback on this, right? I'm kind of like simplifying, but so we put a knockback on it. So now it's like, okay, now when you hit the thing, it kind of like flies away from you like a billiard ball, right? And then we're like, well, that's kind of annoying now because when you chop it, it just flies away, and you got to chase it down and chop it again, and it flies away. All right, let's make it so that just like once it's taken enough damage, so it has like a very low HP pool, right? So like if you hit it with anything reasonable, it'll die. But instead of just like instantly dying, it'll get knocked away, and then it will explode and do something to the surrounding resources or the surrounding area. And so we started playing with that, and it turned out to be like super fun and dumb to kind of just like knock these things around, knock them into each other. And so we just started layering in more and more interactions with what this thing does to other things in the zone when it explodes. And it's just become this like really weird, cool toy/resource that you can use on stuff as well as collect the materials from it. And it'll do all kinds of, I'm not going to go into like what it does, but it does a bunch of different things to different kinds of things. And it's like very layered and cool. And we couldn't have just thought of all of that in advance because everything is self-reflective, you know?
Yeah.
Like when we're testing this thing, if I'm just running around the world and I hit it and it flies over to something and then it explodes and nothing happens. And in my mind, I'm like, that doesn't feel that good. Yeah. Well, something should happen there, you know? Let's figure that out. But being able to actually jump into the game, play it, identify those moments, and then very quickly try out that idea is how we can do it now. And we were able to iterate on this drift bulb thing with no code. Like never even closed down the game, just got it in there and got all these mechanics layered in without ever having to hit the compile button. Right? So it's working. Like our plan with the Game Changer and all the stuff it is working. Our goal was our internal stated goal was 0 cycle time, as in like the moment you have an idea, that idea is in the game. Of course, that's literally impossible without mind reading technology, but man, we're down. We went from months to minutes.
Yeah, that's really great. But I think I do want to point out though that because the game is so dense, so where it's like, yeah, the resources exist, they have these abilities, they're doing the things we want them to do now, right? In the second zone, there's still basically hundreds of things. There's just so many things to do, right? The scale of the game we're building is so big that like, even though it's only taken X amount of time to get here, and yeah, we have another zone left too. I guess I would just say it's still going to take a bit because we have a lot of many things that happen after these resources are done, because we have to make the components. You have to make all of the interactions that allow you to get those components. All these other different things need to happen, let alone building out the equipment sets and everything else. So
even when it's as fast as possible, it's still hard and slow. And
yes,
most importantly, at high volume, right? So like, so it's still.
Well, it's the Jevons paradox in action, right? Because basically now we can easily layer in all these really cool interactions. Like if you have an idea now, there's a pretty good chance you can do that thing in the game. Which means that we're just gonna have way more things in the game, way more complex interactions, much bigger ecosystems, much more interesting AI on the creatures, all this stuff. It doesn't mean that, if we were making a game like Flop Rocket with this model, yeah, it would take a minute, right? I mean, Flop Rocket itself took 8 hours to make, period, right?
Right.
And And so like we wouldn't even use a tool like this to make a game that's that simple. The whole point of a tool like this is to be able to make a very deep, complex game, right? And so now the challenge or the burden is where it's supposed to be, which is just us figuring out what we want and continually iterating on what we have until it feels like what we want, which also means looping back, right? So yeah, it took this amount of time to sort of framework out the second zone, but is it done? No, because now we can play it. We can play in there and we can experiment with things and be like, does this feel right? Does this feel good? And we can kind of loop back through and adjust scales of things, colors of things, behaviors, mechanics.
Well, I do want to say, I think what's interesting about all this is that, years ago, and again, if you could look at Seth's DevOps talk on YouTube, there's a good example of this talking about the art process being a thing that was generating art too fast, given how quickly the rest of development moved, right? We've now landed in the inverse of this, right? The reality is like basically making the content that goes into the game from a technical level on art, or in like our narrative case, designing and writing the quests, right? That is now the slowest part, right?
Yeah, because it's just somebody has to do it.
Somebody's got to do
the art. Somebody has to write the quests, right?
Yeah.
But the burden is not in the.
There's no implementation time for those things, also, right?
Yeah, it's not the integration. It's just like actually just like thinking through it, being like, what should the story be for this thing, and taking the time to just decide.
Mm-hmm. And then
that's where most of the time.
The physical act, basically, to me, like of creating the thing now that goes in is what is hard, is what takes longest. So in my case, like, oh yeah, we want this thing to do this. It's going to animate like this. Okay, now it takes 2 days, 3 days to go do that animation, right? But it's
and you are directly implementing that asset into the game with nobody else's involvement. So you don't have to wait 3 months for me to do it or anything.
Yeah, and so it's a very interesting shift overall, I think, in the studio structure, and we've talked about this a lot, where the way that you work constrains the kinds of things you can make, where it's reflected in the kinds of things that you can make, right? And it's interesting and weird to me, because the whole goal when we started off with this whole thing was authored content at scale. That was the internal idea. If we can get to a point where we can make very unique things just at a ridiculous pace, then not only will we be able to make this game, but then for whatever we do next, like everything will start.
We've got all the tech now.
It is weird seeing it all kind of happening. And I don't know. I'm very excited.
It has also felt very weird for me because when we switched over to the Game Changer, I basically became a tools developer and a game systems designer, which I've always been a game systems designer, but I was also implementing content into those game systems myself and programming the mechanics of each of those individual types of things. So like the Wompit in Crashlands is a custom bespoke coded object. Each creature is completely custom coded. They do share some, scripts and some behaviors and stuff, but every single one of them is made of code that I wrote, right? And in Crashlands 2, we have one object called O_creature. And that is an object that just reads stuff that we set up in the Game Changer and becomes the creature that is being portrayed at that time. So I kind of felt like over the past couple of years, I kind of moved away from being like a game designer. And like, I'm not like directly like putting things into the game. I was more like making things that let other people put stuff into the game. But now things have come full circle where the systems are there, the tools are working. And one of my biggest value adds now to the team is using the Game Changer, using the tools that I made to frame out the mechanics and iterate on balance and stuff while the art team is pumping out assets and while Jen is working on all of the quests and stuff. But I can do that in a way that when I set that up in the Game Changer, other people can come in and continue that work and pick up where I left off. Whereas before, that wasn't a possibility.
Well, also, I think the fascinating thing is like it is faster now, even for you.
Yeah.
Which is like, that was never the case. Like everything we tried to do before, we could never actually make it so that if Seth just wasn't directly the one hard coding something in, that it wouldn't be, that it would be faster.
Exist.
Right. Yeah. And now it's like a lot, I mean, most of the things now are just, they are faster when we're doing this content push, especially at this scale, right? There's no way you could hand code all of the stuff we've done so far, like with each one just redo it again like we did, with the original.
No. And if you kind of look back at the first Crashlands, by and large, the things that you came across in the zone. So, for example, like in the first zone, we had like the log tree, right, as one of the first resources you come across. Well, what does it do? It's a tree. It just sits there and you chop it down and stuff comes out. And then later on in the zone, you come across the squee, which is a plant. What does it do? Well, it just sits there like a tree, and you just hit it, and then it breaks, and you get stuff out of it, right? And that was kind of the theme. Where like in the first game, each object was still custom made, but it was so hard to do that each thing you came across had to be fairly one-dimensional and a lot simpler. And now we can have things in the world that interact with each other, that change over time, that have like have different behaviors depending on where they are, or if it's day or night, or things that are reactive to what you do to them. Things you can knock around the zone and explode onto other things. Just it's very easy to do those things now, and so that's just what the game is becoming. Just this very dynamic world that has just weird stuff that you can discover and weird interactions.
I think the goal is really like as you travel through this thing, it's like every turn you take, you find a new thing. You're just like, what the fuck? And then you see it, and then later maybe even you see it do thing that you've never seen it do before, or some interaction you've never seen before, and you're like, what? And the whole thing just keeps on feeling like it's a fucking place. It's a real place, with all these layered interactions in it. It's very exciting.
It's an ecosystem. These things were already coexisting and interacting with each other before you got there, and you just show up, and the more you pay attention and learn about how they're interacting with each other, the more you can take advantage of that to get some extra free resources or use this thing to blow up that thing or, whatever. So yeah, it's been pretty cool. All right, I think we have time for one question.
That's it.
So, highest uploaded question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from Disgruntled Pineapple, who says, "Hey guys, I was listening to your episodes following the Shenana Jam." So these episodes were probably half a decade ago or something. And you were talking about finishing a card game called Snuppies. I love a good card game, and everybody loves a good competitive game. So I was curious, what happened and why did you kill it off? P.S. I'm that guy who commented on YouTube about the fish fights while ice fishing. Since kids are warned to leave at the beginning of the podcast, I was wondering if you would endorse fish fights as a sport for adults. So I just want to make a note here. So I saw this question, and then I was like, what? What are you talking about with this fish fighting thing? Because the PS says, I'm that guy who commented on YouTube about the fish fights. We have a lot of YouTube videos, and I don't know
also a lot of
where
comments.
That comment was. It turns out that it was one of the hundreds of comments on one of our Crashlands 2 videos from like 5 months ago or something. And oh man, that took some sleuthing to find that comment. So just as again about the silent crashes kind of thing, if you could give us a little bit of a context of where, if you want to refer to something else in your comment, give us a little breadcrumb, because man, that took some work to figure out where this comment was.
But in particular, with understanding that it could take any amount of time, including never, before we get to any particular question.
Yeah, we may have forgotten a lot.
Yeah, because this one is 5 months old. Because it is true that because the video this was on was the one about combat design in Crashlands 2, right? And in that video, we talk about using fish as weapons, right? And then there was this person who commented in that, saying something about this. And one of us did reply to that comment, right? So but
it's been
one of
us so
did see,
who knows?
And if we were answering that question at that moment, probably one of us would have been like, oh yeah, I remember that. And then that would have been, but here 5 months later, this is a very different story where I was like, because I also even I didn't even remember mentioning fish in that video that I made.
Because we don't remember much.
Any of it.
So to answer the latter question quickly, yeah, of course, fish fights should be endorsed for adults. I'm down for gladiatorial style, wielding a trout, beating people with it. I think it's great.
Just make sure you have the right liability waivers, make sure everyone's consenting, et cetera. And then, just stab each other as much as you want to with fish.
Wield a swordfish. That's called a swordfish for a reason.
I want to add a caveat, which is my general opinion about fishing and hunting is that it's unearned and you should catch that fish with your bare hands. That's the only legit way, because then then you give him a chance, to
fight.
I disagree. That's in my opinion, that's still too bougie. I think you need to go catch them with your teeth.
Ooh,
If
yeah.
you can't catch it just with your teeth,
You're not a real hunter /
No
fisher.
equipment. No equipment at all. None.
And using hands
gotta-
even, like that takes advantage of what it means to be human, you know?
That's true. Fish don't have hands.
Yeah.
You got
It's
to
unfair.
even the playing field. Tie your hands behind your
Actually,
back. You
fish
dive
don't
into that
have
water.
teeth either, so you have to use your lips and only your
Well,
lips.
some do.
They have teeth.
Some do.
Okay, if you're catching a fish with teeth, you could use your teeth.
Oh, I see. You're saying basically get on the level.
You got to get on the
of
level.
whatever
make
you're
it
fighting.
fair. Yeah.
Well, you know, that also means
because
that if you're going like, I don't know, deer hunting or something, you know, deer don't stand up straight. You know what I mean? They don't stand up.
Yeah, you
on
got to
two
get on
legs,
all
so-
fours.
Well, they do when they
fours.
fight. They actually they get on their back legs and they beat the crap out of stuff.
But they
with their
headbutt
hooves, you know.
things. You know what I mean? So if you want to take down a deer, you better be
You
on all
strap,
fours.
you strap
and then
on some
headbutt.
antlers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you could headbutt a deer successfully to hunt it, then I think you could just hunt as many as you want. We don't even need licensing for that.
You need a
Yeah.
license.
I mean, you show up with a gun and you shoot a deer. I'm not impressed.
no.
Completely unimpressed. Give the deer a gun. Let's strap a Glock to that deer's back and
Give the deer
we'll see.
hands and a gun and camouflage.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
engineered also so that it has the intelligence of a person. And now it's real hunting.
Now it's the most dangerous game.
Yeah, you gotta bring
You're gonna go out
yourself
there.
to
You're gonna
its
hunt that.
level
You're gonna
or
hunt
vice
that deer.
versa.
Yeah, it's too. Hunting and fishing way too asymmetrical. It's unethical in that.
You got to be
in that
like
respect,
the
you know?
Predator in the new Predator movie, right? Where the Predator like fights everything it sees, but only after like trying to relatively match itself. You know,
Yeah, because if it sees an unarmed person or a sick person or whatever, it's like, nah, that's
the
not.
Predator
that's
fights
not
a bear, right? It fights a
The Predator
huge-ass
fights
bear.
things. The Predator fights things that can kill it.
That's the
You
point.
know, I mean, granted, it still does use like lasers and shit.
It's
so
still
even then, it's
really
like, come on,
outclassing
man.
the
Yeah.
opponent. Yeah, absolutely. But
And it's invisible. I mean, what?
But it
Perhaps
tries
not
to
a good
bring a
example,
sense
you
of
know?
fairness. No, but I think it was one of the fun things about that movie, or Prey, I guess is with a specific movie, right? But it's one of the fun things about it is you like watch the Predator like have this sense of fairness, you know. And again, a wrong sense of fairness.
A
you know?
very loose definition.
It's just like a hunter sense of
It's still
fairness,
yeah,
right?
exactly, but it's the same idea, right? Where it's but it like because when it goes to fight a bear, it like doesn't use its ranged weapons, you know, because it's
Yeah,
like,
it fights it in hand-to-hand
fights
combat.
it in hand-to-hand combat because that's what the bear's doing. And sure, yeah,
It gets its claws out. You know, it's like, okay, bears have claws. All right, well, okay, we're about even there.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So do
I
that.
guess the Predator's
you know?
an example of the whole like, you know, let's take this outside, you know, just
Yes.
man to man, no frills. You got to bring that if you're fighting a deer or a trout. So that's what I
Yeah.
would see.
So if you've earned those fish ethically through direct equal combat, you know,
Yeah, if you
then
become a
you
fish
do-
to defeat the
Yeah.
fish, impressive.
then you do whatever you want with that fish. But if you just throw some bait on a hook, throw that in there, you're just drunk on a boat, right? And then you just yank up a bunch of fish, and then you take their unearned corpses and start hurling them at each other for some reason. That's just disrespectful.
Yep.
You know, you gotta elevate your game. You know, that's really hunting for sport.
It is.
You know.
What was the first? What was the actual question?
Snuppies about the card game. Okay.
Oh, I mean, the short of it is actually it's kind of the same as what we just talked about, which is that the scale at which we were trying to work with that thing and the way in which we were trying to work on it couldn't jive with our production processes at the time.
Our production processes were very good for mechanically interesting games that were fairly simple in content, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, not super deep, right?
So if you want a large number of very complex interactions between things, our development style didn't really work for that with our production processes. Now with something like we actually had talked about not about making Snuppies, but just like when we were putting together the Game Changer and it was starting to actually work, and we were looking at it and we were like, man, this would be so great to make something like a card game with.
Yeah.
Just because you can just add all these fields to the thing, and but also with the Snuppies game, it became Whippersnappers as a concept. I think we worked on it for like 5 months.
Well, the Snuppy Wrestling game. What was it?
Oh no, not Whippersnappers.
Yeah, Whippersnappers was the one we made
that's something
afterwards.
else. Yeah,
Whippersnappers was like the basically Quadrupus Rampage 2 sort of co-op vibe.
yeah. Snuppies
we did
was
that
the
one.
game.
Yeah, we did that one after we dropped Snuppies, which was Scuffle Buddies was actually what it was called.
Scuffle Buddies. Yeah.
Yeah. For some reason, as soon as the word Snuppies came in, Scuffle just was deleted from my brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but
Yeah,
we also
Snuppy Rustling became Scuffle Buddies is what happened. So
Yeah.
so Snuppy Rustling I think is on our itch, isn't it?
It is. You can play it. Yeah.
Because that was the jam game that we did. And then Scuffle Buddies, I don't think is playable
It is not anywhere. Yeah. All we released was like a piece of cover art, I think, for it. And basically it's like it took the Snuppy Wrestling idea, which is this weird combo of it's like a team-based pet collector thing, but also with some weird Angry Birds shit going on. You chuck a ball at people.
it was some combo of like Pokemon, Capture the Flag, and Hearthstone.
It was very strange. It's a very strange way. It was fun.
I don't know if we could have sold it. It's one of those games that like it could have because there's a particular niche there that does actually exist, right? So it's like possible that it could have worked, but it's just weird enough.
It's very strange.
That it feels like it would have been either a complete flop or a huge hit and just nothing in between, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And oftentimes, games are discussed or marketed on this idea of like it's a fusion between like these other things that you love, But I think for that to really work, the Venn diagram has to have some space in it.
Yeah, it's gotta make sense.
Like where those things overlap, you need lots of wiggle room to do a whole bunch of really interesting things. And I think what we kind of ran into with Scuffle Buddies was as we were fleshing out the mechanics of the actual card game kind of part of it, it was starting to feel like that wasn't gonna be enough to make a really compelling game. And so we started layering in extra meta level stuff where we're like,
gotta go capture buddies.
You got to capture them. Like, how do you get these buddies to scuffle with and blah, blah, blah. And so we had like an open world. You'd go out there and you would lay down traps and bait, and buddies would appear
come out
from
of
the
the bushes.
environment. Yeah. We had like a capture game and stuff like that. But it's just kind of
pretty good.
Yeah. And the thing is, if we had kept going with it, I think, as with all of our games, like with enough time and enough iteration, we'll find a good game in there. But will it be a game that people can get? Like,
well, the studios survive it once we launch it. That's the
because a game is good doesn't mean people are going to buy it. We talk about the nail and whiff thing. Like, we probably would have nailed it. But is that what people want?
Yep.
And probably not. So sometimes you just gotta cut your losses, And I think actually over the winter break, when we were about 5 months into Scuffle Buddies, was when I put together a jam project over that break that became Level Head. Mm-hmm. I was like, I wonder what it takes to make like a platformer editor thing, and it was pretty easy actually. And it turns out that making a good platformer is not easy, but the editor part was easy. So that's what happened with the Scuffle Buddies, formerly Snuppy Rustling. And like Sam said, you can go to our itch.io page, and I'm pretty sure Snuppy Rustling is still on there. Don't know if it works, but it's on there. Mm-hmm. And that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa Acosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost it up the charts, and it'll help the game out as we get closer to launch. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.